Hi everybody and welcome to Thursday night's talk in the Northumberland National Park Dark Skies Festival. I'm Roy, been your host all week and I will continue to be so. And tonight we've got a fantastic talk, one I have seen before, from Gateshead to Galaxies, the peculiar history of a Geordie Telescope. And we're going to hear that story from Dave Newton, who used to work with me together at Kielder Observatory. That's how I met Dave. And Dave will obviously introduce himself in a reasonable amount of detail shortly. But those of you who've been watching these presentations will know that I'd like to do a little bit of an introduction to the festival and what it's all about and what you can expect. It's only 3 or 4 slides and it'll just take a few minutes. And then, of course, we have to go through the normal jumping through the hoops of sharing a screen on Zoom. I'm getting pretty good at this now, though, I think. There we go. So, as I said, welcome. This is the first official Northumberland National Dark Sky Festival. And I'm the director of Astro Ventures and one of the learning directors of the observatory, Battleside Observatory. I'm your host, as I've said. So this year, obviously, what we're doing is we're meeting online. You may have heard of this horrible COVID pandemic that's kind of coursing through the land. So unfortunately, this year we're not seeing you in person. Now, next year, we do hope that'll change. Obviously, on Monday, we're getting our roadmap, so perhaps we will see you sooner than that. That'd be great if we can see you sometime this year under our wonderful, pristine dark skies. Have a look at that picture there. Thanks to Mark McNeil for letting us use his wonderful galaxy picture there of the Sycamore Gap. We've had to really put our thinking caps on and come up with a fantastic range of speakers for you. And the onlineness, is that a word, of this has meant that we've got some fantastic international speakers from all across the world. And I think Dave is beaming in from the coast of up in Northumberland somewhere, or up near there anyway. So not too international for David this evening. Anyway, so we only really thought about the festival in November last year. We put it together very last minute, and it is a collaboration between the 4 observatories. That's Kielder Observatory that you can see there with that beautiful picture by Dan Monk, the Milky Way there arching over the observatory with its turrets open. We've got Liam Reed's Stonehoff Astronomy, the observatory viewing platforms and so on that he's built himself up at the village of Stonehoff in the Forest of Wark. Liam's also a volunteer. No, actually, not a volunteer anymore. He works up at Kielder Observatory as well. He's got a fantastic enthusiasm for the subject, and I wholeheartedly recommend that you go and see him. The latest addition to our astronomy family in Northumberland is Will Chung, who runs the Twice Brood Observatory, which is just next door to the Sill Discovery Centre, which is like the this amazing visitor centre, just about a 10-minute walk away from Sycamore Gap. And there's the view out of the roof of the observatory of Twice Brood. Fantastic skies there. And finally, last but not least, the observatory I help design and build and that I run with my team. And actually, if you spoke to Chris, if you were here on Saturday night, he's our observatory manager up there at the Battleside Observatory in Wark, in the village of Wark. Wonderful places. Obviously, we really hope that you can come and see us soon. When's it going to end? Hopefully in the next few weeks. We are in the YouTube chat already. I can see a few people there. Evening, everybody. Hi, Anthony. Hi, Doug. Hi, David, Robert, Penny, Peter, Lynn. Be curious and ask questions as we go. We will try and answer them if they're generally astronomical. But if they're about David's topic that he's talking about, Dave's topic, I'll probably have to make a note of those and fire those at Dave and as we get to the end. And as you have all been, every single night, it's been absolutely wonderful to host you because everyone's just been really kind and lovely in their comments, and let's hope that continues. The final slide from me is that obviously what we really want to do is promote dark skies, not just out in dark sky parks, but in urban areas as well, towns and cities. And to that end, we are supporting the IDA, the International Dark Sky Association. And if you want to get involved in that, all you've got to do is head across to their website there. You can just donate to their cause. They're an international charity working all across the world, or you can join. And there are various ways that you can join. I'll leave that for you, excuse me, to explore in your own time. But get across to the IDA website. They are a wonderful group of people. And I'm going to hand over to Dave now, Dave Newton. I'm going to stop showing my screen. Hopefully that's worked okay. And yeah, I think I've done that right.
Lovely. Thank you very much,
yeah,
Roy.
Over to you. Thanks, Dave.
Yep, thank you very much. I will try and share my screen now. The most important bit. Let's see if we can get this to run for you. So any second now, you should be able to see this up on your screen. So I don't know if Roy, could you give me a bit of feedback? Is that visible now to everyone?
I'm just double checking. I think it is. I've got a picture of the, looks like the Galaxy, and a wonderful picture of what I must guess is the Newall telescope.
Indeed it is, yes. Thank you. Great. Okay, so that's possibly the most dangerous part of the talk over with. We've managed to share the presentation for you all to see. Marvellous. Okay, well, thank you all for tuning in tonight and listening to this little bit of local history. So what I'll do tonight is I'll take you through this rather interesting story, or I think it's a rather interesting story. And hopefully it'll encourage some of you to do a bit of digging for yourselves and see where exactly this was located, and maybe look up where the telescope is now. So just before we go any further, just a word about myself. As Roy mentioned, we met up at Kielder Observatory, where I was working for a spell. My own involvement with astronomy goes back a long, long way. I've been interested in space for as long as I can remember. And I was fortunate enough to go to Newcastle University to study astrophysics. I graduated there in 1990. And then 3 years after that, I was one of the founder members of the Sunderland Astronomical Society. And I've been around on the local astronomical scene ever since. So I would imagine that maybe one or two people on this Zoom call will have run across me before in the local region. This talk actually came about 7 years ago when I was giving a talk at Central Library. I was doing my usual thing there, giving a presentation to an audience about galaxies, about the expansion of the cosmos, about the Hubble stunt, cosmology and galaxies. That's really my sort of main interest in this field. And at the end of the talk, a gentleman near the front of the audience said to me, "Did you know that Gateshead once had the largest telescope in the world?" Which threw me slightly because I didn't know that. And as it turns out, that's not strictly true. But I said, "No, I didn't know that. Please tell me more." And it turned out that one of this gentleman's forebears owned a very large property in Gateshead. And he had this very, very large telescope built there. And this started a bit of a detective story for me. And over the last 7 years, I've been gradually putting together a bigger and bigger picture of this period of time, sort of in the 1860s, 1870s and onwards. And I guess it's one of those detective stories. It's never going to stop if I don't want it to. You keep uncovering a little bit of history and another character to investigate, and it just gets bigger and bigger. So I could talk probably for several hours on this whole period of history and about this telescope and the characters involved. Promise I won't do tonight. I've stripped out a lot of it, so we're just going to talk about the telescope itself, the observatory, and the people that built it and used it. So coming back to this question then, did we know that Gateshead had the largest telescope in the world? Right, the pictures here were taken from the journal Nature. These drawings here, and they represent what is now known as the Newall telescope. And as you can see from these scale drawings, it was a very, very large telescope indeed. But it was never the largest telescope in the world. There were larger ones at the time, and since there have been much larger ones. But at that time, it was the largest telescope which used a lens at the front, what we call a refracting telescope. And it was quite an achievement. There was nothing else like it when it was built, and it inspired a lot of people later on to try and build bigger and better. This was the pattern that they used to try and build something better. But more on that later when we discuss the legacy of this. I'm pleased to say that there is now a blue plaque in Gateshead on one of the buildings on the Ferndene estate, which is where the builder of this telescope lived. And the plaque has got his name on it there, Robert Stirling Newall, JP, born in 1812, and he died in Ferndene in 1889. Now, the Ferndene estate is just over the road, literally, from Saltwell Park, and I would hope many of the people on the call here know Saltwell Park in Gateshead. It's a lovely park to visit, well worth going, just for the park itself. But over the road from there, you have what has largely been built on now, but the Ferndene estate. And there is a little part of it, the lodge at the bottom end of the estate, that is still there. And that's where this blue plaque is located. Now notice on the plaque it says here, third line down of the main text, a keen astronomer owning the world's largest telescope. No, not quite correct. So even the blue plaque doesn't quite have it right, I'm afraid. But it's nice that there's a plaque there to commemorate this, because it's a bit of history that isn't very well recognized. Anyway, tonight we're going to ask a few questions. We're going to ask about who built this telescope, where exactly was it located, and if you want to visit it, you can try and track down the location for yourself. Who used the telescope? Was it just a plaything for Robert Stirling Newall, or did other people use it? Importantly, does it still exist? And finally, what is the legacy of this once great telescope? So we'll go through all of those during the course of the next 45 minutes or thereabouts. Okay, so the Northeast Astronomical Heritage. If anybody was on the call last night and they listened to David Hughes talking about the great Geordie space race, there is a very, very strong astronomical heritage in this region, and a lot of famous names going back to the Venerable Bede. One of the names that isn't normally mentioned is Robert Stirling Newall, and I think that's a bit of a shame because this telescope was groundbreaking in its day, and it did sort of set the pattern for telescopes to come after that, and observatories as well. It was the first of its type. So yeah, it was a groundbreaking bit of history, and it's a shame it's not better known. Anyway, here's the man himself. This is the chap that created this telescope. Robert Stirling Newall, originally from Dundee. He was born up in Scotland, died in Ferndene in Gateshead in 1889. And over on the right-hand side, we see a picture of the thing that brought him fame and fortune. This is a telegraph cable, an undersea telegraph cable. Stirling very cleverly found a way to make these undersea cables, and he made a fortune out of it. He became a very, very wealthy man indeed from this invention. This is where he lived. This is the main Ferndene House, round about 1860. Unfortunately, it no longer exists. The house has been demolished and it's been built over. But we can identify still where this house was located and where the telescope itself was actually located. Okay, so 1848, we've got a little picture here showing R.S. Newall and Company, Patent Wire Rope Works, Gateshead. Originally started engineering works up in Dundee, but in some point between those dates, some point in that decade, he moved down to Gateshead because all of the engineering, the workforce that he needed was here. It was a better location. So this is when he moved to Gateshead, somewhere in that decade. What sparked the interest in sort of cables and wire rope was a friend of his called Lewis Gordon, who was studying mining over in Germany. And he wrote to Newall, urging him to invent a machine for wire ropes. And this got Newall thinking about this problem. Nobody had done this before. He was an engineer and an inventor of some note, a very, very clever chap, a very driven chap. And this is exactly what he did. He invented some machinery to weave wire together into sort of metal ropes. And in 1840, he took out a patent for certain improvements in wire rope and the machinery for making such rope. This picture here jumps forward to 1868, and you can see this sort of flyer advertising his wares for ship's rigging. It had a multitude of uses, particularly for shipping and in industry. But I think more what he's remembered for is this development in using these wire ropes and being able to sink telegraph cables into the middle of them and then insulate them. These days they would use plastic, or in early times maybe rubber. Originally they used a substance called gutta percha. It's a bit like rubber, it's sort of a natural resin. And Newall found a way to sort of embed the telegraph cables in these sort of wound wire ropes, which made ideal telegraph cables. And he was in this business to start. And the very first undersea cable in 1851, which went from Dover to Calais, that was actually made by his factory. And shortly after, 1853, invented some machinery which helped no end to actually lay these cables in deep sea. And I think the very first cable, the transatlantic, about a third of that cable there actually came from Newall's factory. By the time that one came along, other people had got involved in it as well. But a third of that undersea cable was actually manufactured by Newall's company. He was very hands-on. He liked to see exactly what was going and direct it himself. He was a very strong character. And it took him all over the world with these cables. He was there directing the actual submergence of many of them. We won't go through these, but the last one was quite interesting. The Suez to Aden and Aden to Karachi cable exercise there. Note the original spelling of Karachi. That was quite notable because on the way back from that, he was shipwrecked. The P&O ship, the Aden, the Alma, sorry, was actually struck a reef and sank on the way back. Fortunately, there was no loss of life. The cargo, it was mail that was being brought back on the ship, that was completely lost, but there was no loss of life. Fortunately, there was another P&O ship, and HMS Klops was nearby, which rescued everybody. And that kind of put paid to his overseas enterprise. He sort of retired from being so hands-on at this point. Later on, he went into politics instead, and he was twice the Mayor of Gateshead. So he was a very sort of influential and notable person in Gateshead in this period of time. Again, which makes me wonder why this isn't better known, this little piece of history. It wasn't just wire rope and cables he had a hand in, he was also involved in chemicals, sort of insulation for these ropes and things. And if we look at the census for 1881, he's actually noted as a chemical manufacturer. And at this point, his family are in on it as well. One of his sons, Frederick Newall, he's also noted as a chemical manufacturer. And his other son, Arthur Newall, there is noted as a wire rope maker. So Arthur Newall had taken over the sort of cable business by the time we get to the 1880s. Who is missing from this census report? Somebody which actually crops up later in this talk is Hugh Frank Newall. And Hugh Newall was his other son. Not in Gateshead at the time of the census, because I think he was in Cambridge. He would have been down at Cambridge University at the time. He was the academic of the family. He was the astronomer that followed Robert Newall, so he has a big part in this story later on. Slightly sideways step now, I'm going to mention Newall's father-in-law, because Robert Stirling Newall married in 1849 Mary Pattinson, the youngest daughter of Hugh Lee Pattinson. Now, if anybody's on the call from Washington, they might recall that name from the Pattinson Industrial Estate, which isn't far from the Fowl Park, where the Sunderland Society have their observatory located. Pattinson was an industrial chemist, basically. Did a lot of work with sort of refining metals, in particular silver. Originally from Ulston, he set up in Gateshead as well, because the workforce and all of the engineering was there. And that was 1834 that he set up in Gateshead. And he later sold that business to his son-in-law, Robert Stirling Newall, 1872. And we find that actually Pattinson and his three sons-in-law, they all had a part in each other's business. They all shared the risk. It was quite an interesting business model for that period of time. Patterson's better known, though, for his photography. He was an early photographer, and a series of daguerreotype photos from 1840 over in America. And this here is one of his, and it's the first ever photograph of the Niagara Falls and what would later become Canada. It wasn't even a country in 1840. And if you look at the bottom left of this picture, you see a gentleman standing there with a top hat, and we think that is Pattinson. This is kind of self-portrait at Niagara Falls. So he was a very interesting character as well. Patterson, Newall, Newall's brother-in-laws, turns out actually they were all members of the Natural History Society of Northumbria, which had quite an interesting collection of members, including Joseph Swan, the inventor of the light bulb, the Backhouse family, some of those members were there, and of course the Hancock brothers of the Hancock Museum fame. They all knew each other. They were all part of the same crowd. So it was a very interesting period of time. Patterson retired from business in 1858, though, and he wanted to devote his time to astronomy and the maths and physics to support that. And I'm afraid perhaps the stress of that finished him off, because he also died at the end of 1858, sadly. But he had bought himself a 7.5-inch Equatorial telescope, which seems to have been a very nice instrument. I don't know where that instrument went to. We know that it was used periodically by the Astronomer Royal for Scotland, so it must have been quite a good instrument, we think. And I do wonder if this is what sparked Newall's interest in astronomy. Going forward a few years, Newall got an interest by this time, and he discovered 2 glass discs that could be turned into lenses. 25 inches in diameter these discs were, which was pretty big size back in that day. Nobody had attempted to make anything quite that big. And these discs have been made by the Chance brothers of Smethwick in the West Midlands. These were a big name in glass making at the time. They were starting to make a lot of glass for things like lighthouses, for cameras which were just coming in, and telescopes. And they'd actually built what was called the Craig Telescope, located down in London, which was a 24-inch refractor, which was, very, very big for its time. It was the largest refracting telescope in the world for a period. And the picture there shows what a strange contraption it was when we look at it now. There was no dome for it. It wasn't covered. You just had this big tower and the telescope tube next to it, and it was sort of hoisted into position by chains. So very old-fashioned compared to what we see now. But yeah, this is what Chance brothers were doing. So Newall knew they had the pedigree. They knew that it was a good sort of set of glass discs. He wanted to build a telescope from them. And he actually paid £500 for these glass discs, which was a colossal sum of money back in those days. Chance brothers, he didn't want to take a chance on them, if you excuse the pun. He went to Thomas Cook and Sons of York. Now, Thomas Cook was one of the great names in telescope making, and he trusted Thomas Cook a lot more to actually build a telescope with these glass discs, turning those into the sort of the twin lenses at the front of a refractor. We know that it also had previous dealings with Thomas Cook regards telegraph equipment, sort of industrial equipment. I'm not quite sure what Thomas Cook actually provided for him, but they did have previous dealings, which is why Newall went to Cook and said, "Can you build this telescope, please?" Huge undertaking. Cook massively underestimated the amount of work that would be involved in building this. There were cost overruns, there were time overruns. It got quite litigious. Newall, as I've said, was a very strong character. He wasn't to be messed with. He threatened to take Thomas Cook to court over this and bankrupt the company. And we think it's the stress of this that actually sadly sent Thomas Cook to an early grave. The telescope was delivered in 1870. Sadly, it was after Thomas Cook's death in 1868. It wasn't completed in his lifetime. So that's a bit of a shame that he never got to see this great telescope completed. But it was delivered up to Gateshead and installed at Ferndene in 1870. Now, at this time, photography was coming. We have a nice series of photographs that still exist of the telescope, so we can see exactly what it looked like when it was first installed. So this was 1870. This is the telescope on its sort of massive mount. before it was actually sort of put into the dome which had been built for it. Focal length of 9.1 meters. So yeah, this was a very, very long telescope. The objective lens itself, made from those two glass discs, had a weight of 66 kilograms. And the whole structure, the tube, the mount, the lenses, everything, it had a weight of 9 tons. So this was a fairly hefty piece of engineering. To try and balance this, Thomas Cook, to build the tube in a particular way. You can see it's got this sort of cigar shape where it's thicker in the middle and at the ends. It would have bent under its own weight if it wasn't supported in a very clever way. So there was an inner tube, an outer tube, and a series of cables, I think, that sort of balanced the weight to prevent it from just bending under the weight. So very clever design, which isn't immediately apparent when you just look at it. This is the dome for it. The dome was designed and built by Robert Stirling Newall himself. It was built in one of his factories. So all his own work, the dome. Now you think back to that previous picture of the other telescope the Chance brothers built, where the scope was slung up by those chains down the side of a building. Putting a telescope in a dome that rotated was actually a pretty new invention at this time. So it wasn't just the telescope that was groundbreaking, it was the dome itself. This was, you know, clever stuff, very, very clever engineering. A couple of pictures here from the archives showing the refractor in use. The left-hand one, I think that's Newall there peering through the eyepiece, just posing for the photograph. Over on the right, there are a number of people in this, which we think, if we sort of look at an extract of that picture there, we think we've got Newall on the top right, we've got his wife next to him, one of his sons, I think, is kneeling down on the left-hand side of the platform. And sitting at the bottom, I believe that is a chap called Albert Marth, who was a professional astronomer. Newall had hired this astronomer to actually oversee the installation of the telescope and used it. And he hired him in 1868, expecting the telescope to arrive then. And it wasn't until 2 years later, of course, that it actually arrived. So Albert Marth was the professional astronomer that worked there on the telescope and did, if you like, the proper science to prove this telescope's worth. And there's a little chap hiding just in the background behind Marth, and I think that's one of Newall's other sons, but unfortunately I can't name them. It's not clear enough to see who exactly they are. A couple more pictures here. The left one I think was taken from the journal Nature. The right-hand picture shows the eyepiece end of the telescope. Rather interesting focusing mechanism on that. Sort of classic sort of Victorian engineering with this. You see all the sort of cogs and wires that go along with it. Sort of a beautiful piece of engineering. This one's a bit of a mystery. I like this picture and I'm yet to find out exactly what's going on. There's something attached to the eyepiece end which seems to be connected via two curly wires to a Leyden jar. There's some electrical apparatus there that's powered from this sort of primitive battery. No idea what it is. I'm not aware of any astrophotography done at that time with this telescope. Really don't know what they're trying to power with that device. If anyone can advise me of what they think it is, yeah, I'm happy to hear any suggestions. Okay, so the location of this, where was the telescope? It doesn't appear on any Ordnance Survey map because the previous Ordnance Survey before it was built was obviously it just showed the Ferndene state. The next one occurred after it had been demolished, so it doesn't appear on an Ordnance Survey map. But luckily, one of my colleagues at the Sunderland Society, David Beedham, has a municipal map from just the right time, and the telescope is actually marked on there. So we can see Saltwell Park in the middle of the map, and you can see where the lake is. That sort of irregular shaped object there in the middle. That's the sort of the pond in the middle of Saltwell Park. And sort of level with that, to the left of it, just over the road, you can see sort of the disc on the map marked Newall's telescope. And a little bit to the left of that is the Ferndene estate, Ferndene House. So that's where we know exactly from this map where the telescope and its dome was located. In modern terms, if we look at an aerial map of Gateshead, we can work out then exactly where it is. So Ferndene Estate is where we've now got these sort of semi-detached houses built. The bottom of the estate is Ferndene Lodge, and this is the only bit which still exists, and that's where the blue plaque is located. So at that junction between Saltwell Road going off to the left and West Park Road, which heads sort of northwards, that's Ferndene Lodge, where you had the entrance to the big estate. And Ferndene is still marked on the pillars either side of the driveway to the lodge. The perils of Zoom meetings. Okay, so there's Ferndene Lodge.
Hi, sorry. That was exciting.
Always happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, I just wanted to,
yeah, please chip in.
There is someone called Anthea Lang, who is the chair of Gateshead History Society.
Yeah.
Who has said she'd love to meet you and talk about this, because she has a talk on this, and she was involved in getting the plaque
marvelous.
up there. And the reason it doesn't say refracting telescope is they ran out of space on the plaque.
Which so I can understand.
They just ran out of space. Peter Turvey has thrown in, is it possibly a spectroscope with some kind of primitive, I don't know, maybe like an arc to provide reference spectral lines? Maybe not, I don't know.
Maybe, yes, possibly. My own thought was that it was an illuminated reticle. So what you do is you pass a current through the wires to make them glow, and that gives you sort of glowing wires that you can use to track an object accurately through the telescope.
Yes, that makes sense.
These days you would just use a little button cell to make it light up, but back then you just, like a filament lamp, you would pass a current through it. Yeah. There are a number of possibles, and we just don't know for sure. So yeah, like I said, all suggestions would be welcomed.
Well, after that wonderful interruption by Odin, David Hughes is on. He's said, "Ha ha ha, Odin, ha ha, smiley face."
Yeah, indeed.
And an opportunity to fire those couple of questions at you. I'm going to let you crack on.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so if we go back up the road a little bit, this is where the observatory itself actually was located. So if you cross over the road from Saltwell Park and you have a look down the road, you will actually be able to find this pair of semi-detached houses, and the right-hand one is where we think the observatory was located. And from behind, the house is sort of slightly elevated compared to some of the others around it, and we think that might be partly to do with the concrete platform for the original observatory dome. It might still be there under the foundations, which they've reused for the house. And what I think is nice is if you look at the porch on that house there, it's still called Ferndene. It still retains the original name. So look out for Ferndene. That's where the telescope was. Okay, so back to 1870 when the telescope came into operation. Norman Lockyer, the founder and editor of the journal Nature, he absolutely raved about this telescope. He kind of recognized how groundbreaking it was, and he thought it was a wonderful instrument. And he wrote about it in glowing terms in the journal Nature. And Lockyer was a frequent visitor to Ferndene, visited Newall's home, and he used the telescope on many occasions. And he wrote about it in Nature, so you can look those up in the Nature archives if you want to do a search for Newall or Ferndene. Yeah, some quite remarkable drawings from that period of time through the telescope. Newall himself turned out to be a bit of an artist. This is one of his drawings of the Orion Nebula. A quite marvelous drawing, I think, of the Orion Nebula. I think that shows just the level of detail that could be seen through this telescope on a good, clear night when the air would allow. If we compare that with a modern picture of Orion, you can actually see some of the same detail, particularly the sort of the inverted comma at the bottom, that sort of patch of nebulosity there. Newall has actually got that nailed bang on in his drawing. So I think that's a pretty special drawing there. I do like that. Newall wasn't the only person to make drawings of objects through the telescope. We know that quite a few artists actually came there, not just scientists, but artists actually came and stayed at Ferndene. It was a magnet for sort of the famous people of the day. Henry Holliday, one of the pre-Raphaelite artists, he observed there and used it quite a few times. And we have a collection of drawings of Holliday's that we can refer to now. We know that William Morris also stayed there, but I don't have any work that sort of came out of that, unfortunately. Maybe they're buried in the archives somewhere else. Maybe I'll come across them in years to come. But Holliday produced a wonderful series of drawings of lunar craters through the telescope. What I've done in these slides is I've tried to match up some of his drawings with craters under similar lighting conditions, so you can just see how good the level of artistry was here. This one I think is particularly good. Eratosthenes, drawn in 1871. Compare that with the photograph now. You can see all of the features that are being captured there. I think that's a remarkable likeness. Smashing picture. This one threw me when I first saw it. This is one of Henry Holliday's drawings of sunspots taken through the telescope. What this means is somewhere there is or was a solar filter. Now, sunspots, of course, are these amazing features on the surface of the sun. They are slightly cooler than the rest of the surface, which is why they appear dark, but they are still immensely hot, immensely powerful, and a typical sunspot is about the same size as of the Earth. But if you just point your telescope at it, you will fry your eyeball and the optics, probably not a smart thing to do. So you'd need a filter. So somewhere along the line, Newall had invested in or invented his own solar filter to go over it. And based on this drawing of Holliday's, it worked very, very well. Another famous visitor to Ferndene, possibly the most famous visitor, King Leopold II of Belgium. He was one of Queen Victoria's cousins, became the King of Belgium in 1865. We think it was 1887 when he visited the estate. King Leopold has come to some notoriety in later years because of what went on in the Belgian Congo and the immense amount of wealth that was generated from the Congolese people, both his personal wealth and Belgium that gained from it. But huge numbers of people died because of the cruelty and hardship that was inflicted upon them in the Congo Free State. So he quite rightly goes in the infamous list of villains from sort of the 19th and early 20th centuries. But like I say, Ferndene at that time was a magnet for these people. The rich and famous wanted to be seen there with this telescope, and this man that had invented this sort of dome and brought this huge telescope to life. Somebody that wasn't quite as enamored of it, as it turns out, was the professional astronomer that he hired, Albert Marth. Marth was there, I think, for about 5 years, and he had an absolutely miserable time based on the correspondence that he sent. John Couch Adams was one of his correspondents, and there are a number of letters that still exist from Marth decrying how awful it was there in Gateshead. Sky conditions were terrible, the telescope was difficult to use, and the dome, which Newall was very proud of, what a horrible, awful contraption it was to use. Ultimately, I think Marth and Newall were both very strong characters, which is why they didn't really get on that well. And Marth never really sort of achieved his full potential as an astronomer there. And the telescope never achieved its full potential, partly as a scientific instrument. Marth came to note, first of all, when he was working in London. He was German, but he spent a lot of time in London. He discovered an asteroid in 1854. He was no stranger to this area because he worked up at Durham University, where Temple Chevalier and others had also worked over the years. So he was the professional astronomer there. But most of his fame actually came from when he worked out in Malta as William Lassell's assistant. And this is the telescope that he was using in Malta, the 48-inch reflector. So straight away, this is a bigger telescope than Newall's, but it's a reflecting telescope, a totally different design. But looking at the picture, again, you see this throwback to those earlier telescopes where the telescope is open and you have this big tower next to it. In this case, so you can actually reach. But with this rather strange contraption, Newall discovered 600 NGC objects. Colossal number of deep sky objects. An amazing tally. Can you imagine somebody in this day and age sort of discovering anywhere near that number of objects in space? You just couldn't anymore. It just goes to demonstrate what an amazing period of time this was when the universe was really opening up to exploration of modern sized telescopes. One of Marth's discoveries was the Rosette Nebula, which many of you will have seen in pictures, no doubt. The star cluster in the center was previously known, but the nebulosity around it was discovered by Marth. The planetary nebula here, NGC 6751, the glowing eye nebula. You may have seen that in Hubble pictures. Here's a star-forming region, hydrogen region, sort of glowing in deep space with that Hubble palette, NGC 6820. So a range of objects he discovered, but the bulk of those 600 were actually galaxies. Here we have one of his discoveries, NGC 928, the Saturn galaxy, and it does have a remarkable likeness to Saturn through a small telescope. The Little D galaxy, which is actually two interacting galaxies, and if you look through the list of discoveries of Marth's, there are a lot of interacting galaxies in there, and a number of them crop up later, much later, in Alton Harp's catalogue of interacting and strange and unusual galaxies. This is one of my favourites of those, ARP 142, the Penguin Galaxy. I've got a nice Hubble picture of this that shows the penguin in more detail. It looks a bit more like a kingfisher, I always think. But so when penguins incubate their eggs sort of in front of them, it's got that look to it. So it's generally known as the Penguin Galaxy. What it actually is a spiral galaxy that's been deformed by that elliptical galaxy underneath it. The gravity of the one galaxy has sort of twisted and warped this nice spiral shape into this rather peculiar shape. This is another of Marth's discoveries, which is a sort of a small dwarf irregular shaped galaxy, quite an unusual one. ARP 92. Cosmologically, this is an interesting one because there appears to be a bridge of material between the two parts of this galaxy, but they have very different redshifts. So the only explanation is that it must be coincidence. Okay, but that's a whole different can of worms, so let's not go into the redshift controversy tonight. And the very final entry in ARP's catalogue, in Marth's series of discoveries is NGC 7840. So he had the last word on the NGC catalogue. Well, what did he discover from Gateshead? That's easy to answer. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The sky conditions in Gateshead were generally so poor you couldn't use the telescope at its full aperture, so they used to stop it down. This is a technique for improving the view with sort of big telescopes sometimes. And they used to 8 inches, which was a terrible waste when you have sort of a 25-inch telescope, having to stop it down like that. So the sky in Gateshead is not the ideal location for it. It never was, never will be with light pollution today, unfortunately. So there were no real scientific discoveries made from it. It was a really great shame. Robert Stirling Newall had toyed with the idea of getting it moved to the Cape in South Africa, where the sky was much better, but the size and weight of the telescope and the cost of moving it was prohibitive, so it never occurred, nor in his lifetime anyway. After he died, his son, Hugh Frank Newall, decided this was actually a much better idea than leaving it in Gateshead. So he arranged with the University of Cambridge to move everything down there, and the sweetener for the university was that he would work with the telescope and do the science with it and publish results at no cost whatsoever to the university for 5 years. He would fund it from his own sort of family funds, if you like. And the Newall family were very, very wealthy, of course, from the engineering, from the cables and so on. So he didn't have a problem funding himself. Cambridge thought this was a very good idea. And so the telescope was moved and the dome was dismantled and it was all moved down to Cambridge. And actually, it turns out this is where the bulk of its scientific life was performed between 1891 and 1911. Newall conducted this huge series of spectroscopic observations. Excellent results. They are still in the Cambridge archives. And this spectroscopic work continued really until about 1930, when newer, better telescopes had come along and it started to become outdated. Here it is in 1906 down in Cambridge. This next slide shows Frank Newall and his good lady wife, 52. He looks a very happy chap. He looks much better in photographs, much happier than his father ever did, I have to say. This was it in 1930, when it was starting to become obsolete and the decision was made to take it out of service. And this next slide is a very sad one. This is the dome being demolished in 1957. This could have been the end of the story. You reach this point, okay, there's the dome being scrapped. Did they do the same with the telescope? What happened to it? And when I started this this sort of investigation, I thought that it was probably scrapped and turned into mini metros or something. But no, there is a happy ending to this. It was donated to the University of Athens. Cambridge University asked if anybody wanted it, and the University of Athens were interested. They sent a delegation over to look at it, and they said, "We'll take it, please." So it was donated free of charge to the University of Athens, and the university purpose-built this observatory here, just north of Athens in the Penteli Mountains. Not somewhere that I've ever been, but it still exists, it is still in use, and when you see it painted and sort of all done up now, so this modern viewpoint, you see what an amazing instrument this is. How wonderful does that look? Sort of a classic Victorian sort of steampunk looking telescope. You've got those control rods and the wires, the counterweights. It's sort of a marvelous looking telescope. It really is a beautiful instrument. Still used for public outreach, sort of public science. And I think what a wonderful life it's now got. Still in use. I think that's a fantastic way for it to still be in service. And you look at the dome as well, the way it's structured. The dome itself is another sort of beautiful structure that complements the telescope very, very well indeed. I think it's 14 meters across this dome, so it's a pretty sizable building itself. And this next slide shows it on an evening there, pointing out, looking at the Orion Nebula once again, which makes me sort of think back to Newall's drawing of the Orion Nebula there. It's a public observatory. I think you can visit this. I would love to go there someday. If anybody is in the vicinity of Athens, please try and visit it and take a look at this telescope and maybe look at night for yourself. I would love to do that. I really would. Maybe view the Orion Nebula for myself, just to recreate that experience from 150 years ago. So it's still there. I'm really happy to say the telescope is still alive and well and doing sort of science outreach work. But I think an important part of this story is the legacy that came from it. This telescope was the of a new breed of what, as you could call, battleship refractors. These giant steel tubes, sort of rivets and cogs, and that whole steampunk thing. It was the first of its kind, and it started a bit of a race. The publicity that it got started others thinking, well, can we do better? And over in the United States, Alvin Clark and Sons, that came to fame as really great telescope builders, they went one inch better. The US Naval Observatory's 26-inch. And this was the telescope that was used to discover the 2 moons of Mars. Next up, back to the UK. We had to go one better. And Grubb's of Dublin, they produced a 28-inch refractor. And the glass for this one also came from the Chance brothers of Smethwick. But this was the end of the line really for big refractors in this country. The story now moves to America, where Alvin Clark and Sons, they started to produce. They really got the hang of it at this point. So the Lick Observatory 36-inch, an amazing telescope. And I think this is regarded probably as the best of the big 1892, E. Barnard used this to discover the fifth moon of Jupiter. And I think that's Barnard in that picture there. Again, what an amazing telescope that is. You look at that, look at all of those sort of ship's wheels at the bottom end of it. What an amazing instrument. And finally, we come to the world's largest operable refractor, the 40-inch Yerkes telescope. Again, Alvin Clark and Sons built this. You can't go any bigger than this really, because the glass starts to bend and deform under its own weight. So this was the end of the line for these big refractors. Everything bigger than this had to be made from mirrors. But what an amazing period of time this was. You think of all of these discoveries that were made with these telescopes. And I think the legacy is, even today, if you imagine an astronomer, or the popular image of an astronomer in a dome using a telescope, you think of somebody at the eyepiece end of one of these huge refractors peering down this long tube through the sort of slit to the open sky. So it's, to me, this is the Newall's telescope created the pattern for this. It was the pattern that others wanted to build on and do better. And you look at these colossal refractors that were built afterwards, they're the same kind of design, because Newall's telescope is where it came from. And even today, people are trying to recreate this to some extent. Tim Wetherell down in Somerset, I know he's made a few of these quite remarkable sort of throwback steampunk looking telescopes. And I would love one of these, I really would. To me, that is what a telescope is supposed to look like. This is one of his refractors out on the night time. Isn't that a beautiful instrument? Absolutely. So coming back to the original question there, did you know that Gateshead once had the largest telescope in the world? No, it never did. But it did have a telescope that was absolutely groundbreaking for its time, and it set the pattern for telescopes for decades to come. So this is a quite remarkable period of history, and I would like to think that this does become better known in the future. So I'm going to leave it there for tonight. Thank you for your concentration. I hope you found it interesting. And I guess we've got time for a few questions if there are any. Roy?
There's plenty of comments, David. That's a lovely talk, Dave, by the way. Sorry, I always forget to call you David sometimes. Dave. That's the trouble with knowing two David astronomy type people.
I answer to both, so I really don't mind.
Oh, that's okay then. That's okay.
It's fine.
And we are very grateful for Odin's contribution. That's as well.
Did it wake anybody up?
Well, I was just thinking, actually, maybe we should do that anyway, about halfway into these talks, because, you know, it's a nice warm kind of night. If you're snuggled in your house, you're listening to people talking really quite kind of gently and carefully about astronomy, and it's lovely and it's quite hypnotic, and then suddenly wake up. And lots of people commenting on various houses and inventors. Someone called A. Atkinson 1954 is apparently quoting Newall saying, "In 15 years of astronomy in Gateshead, I have only ever had one fine night in which to view the stars."
Yep.
And I commented that I wonder what impact pollution would have had back then, because I'd imagine there'd been a lot of coal going on and burning of coal.
Yes,
and
absolutely,
like
yeah.
that.
Yeah, you think even then Gateshead was quite well populated. Everybody had coal fires in the houses. You didn't have the light pollution that you have now, but you did have smog. There was a lot of smoke in the air permanently. And that I think is what ruined the view. So that quote is absolutely spot on. I think by the time it was moved down to Cambridge, the number of nights when it could actually be used at full aperture were possibly, a few dozen times. That would be it. Certainly in the first few years of operation, it was single figures, the number of good nights that they had. So you can imagine, for a professional astronomer like Albert Marth trying to use it and do science with it, it would be so frustrating.
Yeah.
Every clear night, the smog would just ruin the view. So it was wasted where it was, unfortunately, which is why it did so much better science when it was moved to Cambridge.
Yeah, Anthea has suggested that Newall was complaining a lot about pollution coming from the railway nearby as well. Anthea Lang being the historian, Gateshead historian person. Anthea, if you want to get in touch with us through our Facebook page or through our website astro.ventures, I'd be more than happy to put you in touch with Dave for you to compare notes. I was just imagining if the two of you actually kind of got your heads together on what you knew, you could come up with possibly the mother of all Robert Newall talks. That would be awesome. Yeah, just lots of thank yous. Brilliant. Dave Edmondson says your dog's name is brilliant. The Emperor of Brazil also visited Ferndene.
Yes.
So,
yeah, there were a large number of famous visitors to it. I guess Leopold is one of those that some people might have heard of. You could go on all night listing all of the characters that visited Ferndene and used the telescope. Just a fascinating list of characters involved in it. So yeah, like I said at the start, it's a jigsaw puzzle that just seems to keep getting bigger and bigger. Cool. Yeah, so yeah.
Okay, so yeah, Anthea says she's going to try and get in touch through those suggested ways. That's great.
Yeah, fantastic.
There aren't any specific questions.
Okay.
I would very much like to reiterate, what we were saying last night about the other great telescope in Northumberland that's falling into disarray, the telescope up at Close House. I just think it would be great to see that all cleaned up and polished and wonderful, just like this Newall telescope is being used in Athens. It's beautiful where that location is. Imagine what we could do with that telescope up at Close House. Graham, if you're watching.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, the number of astronomers that would just love to get their hands on a 4-inch telescope.
Yeah.
I would sort of give my right arm, or well, I might give a few eyepieces away, certainly, for the use of a 24-inch telescope. Yeah, amazing instrument. And there's a nice bit of history to that as well. It was the Reverend Espin's telescope, that big reflector up at Close House. So that's another interesting history story as well, that one.
Yeah, well, David Hughes touched upon it last night, which is why we got talking about it last night in his talk. So between the two of you, I think these talks have worked together really, really well, fantastically. So I wonder if that is a good time to say goodnight to our viewers and our guests, and end the live stream then now. And thank you, Dave, very much. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk about astronomy. And I hope we have so much more opportunity to do that, you and I and the team. And when all this horrible lockdown stuff ends.
Indeed, yes.
So thank you. Big round of applause from everybody. Lots of thank yous. You're a star, Dave. Thank you, Dave. Very interesting. Learned a lot, all of that. Lots of great feedback.
Yeah. And thank you all for watching and listening. That's very good of you to tune into this. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Appreciate that. We've had a roughly 40 odd people watching, but actually already 100 repeat views. So it's obviously quite interesting. So with that, thank you, Dave. Thank you to all of our viewers. I will call it a night. The last 3 talks in the festival are tomorrow. We have our Aurora talk with Dr. Martin Kitching from Battlesteads Observatory and Northern Express Wildlife Tours. He's one of our lead astronomers up at the Battlesteads. And Dan Pye from Kielder Observatory, who's just recently been promoted to the director of something, and I forget what. I'm sorry, Dan, but I'm sure Dan will tell us tomorrow. On Saturday, very special guest, Lord Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, will be joining us and talking about, broadly speaking, he said, Roy, how about I just come and talk about life in space for an hour? I'm like, yeah, okay, why not? And then finally on Sunday, a few of us astronomers who have lived and worked in Northumberland for a few years, we are getting together for a little kind of online fireside chat hosted by Duncan Wise and I believe Catherine, who's the CEO of Kielder Observatory. So that should be really interesting, and we hope you can join us for all or some of those talks. But if not, remember that all of these talks will be available to be seen and watched. And again, and if I could ask you to like and subscribe, like this video and subscribe to our channel, that would really help us. Thanks a lot, everybody, and take care. We'll see you soon.